The conference call was scheduled for 9:15 a.m., but by 9:20, 19-year-old Marcus Chen was still listening to his aunt's lawyer explain why a family audit could strip him of both his $40 million medical tech company and custody of his blind mother. 6 weeks to prove administrative competence in all domestic and business affairs, they said. What they didn't say was how a teenager who'd inherited an empire after his father's fatal car crash 8 months ago was supposed to master both boardrooms and bedrooms when he'd already burned through 4 professional caregivers and was about to fire the only person who'd kept his mother stable. Marcus had done the math 3 times that morning, sitting in his Buckhead office overlooking Peachtree Street. The company was bleeding money on redundant healthcare partnerships, and the most obvious cut was Maria Gonzalez's salary. She wasn't certified, didn't have formal training, and cost nearly $4,000 a month when a proper home health aide could do the same job for half that. At least, that's what the spreadsheet told him. He'd found Maria through his father's old assistant after the 3rd caregiver quit. The woman had simply stopped showing up after his mother, Helen, fell twice in one day, trying to navigate from her bedroom to the kitchen. The certified aide before that had lasted 2 weeks before getting caught pocketing Helen's pain medication. The first one, fresh from Emery's nursing program, had quit after 5 days, claiming Helen was non-compliant with standard mobility protocols. Maria was different, but Marcus couldn't figure out why. She showed up every morning at 7:30, spoke quietly with his mother in a mix of English and Spanish that Helen somehow understood despite never learning the language, and kept the house running smoothly. But she was just a housekeeper, Marcus told himself. She cleaned, cooked, and happened to help his mother get around. Nothing a real professional couldn't do better. The decision felt logical when he made it Tuesday morning. He'd called 3 agencies, compared rates, and scheduled interviews for certified home health professionals. Maria's 2 weeks' notice would take them right up to his deadline with the family audit. Clean transition, professional staff, lower costs. His father would have approved of the efficiency. If stories like this gave you hope today, subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet for that. Helen Chen had been an interior designer before the accident, known for creating spaces that felt both elegant and lived in. Now, 8 months after the crash that killed her husband and stole her sight, she moved through her Buckhead home like a ghost, haunting rooms she'd once loved. Marcus watched her Wednesday morning, timing her route from bedroom to kitchen, 12 minutes for a journey that used to take 2. The new caregiver, Janet, arrived promptly at 8 a.m. with credentials from Georgia State and 5 years of experience with visually impaired clients. She introduced herself to Helen with the kind of professional cheer that Marcus recognized from business meetings, explained the mobility routine they'd be implementing, and began rearranging furniture for optimal traffic flow. Within an hour, Helen had knocked over her coffee mug, trying to reach what used to be her morning spot at the kitchen island. Janet, following standard protocols, guided Helen to a chair pulled away from the counter for safety reasons, and began explaining the new system of verbal cues they'd use for navigation. Marcus, working from his home office, heard his mother's quiet, "I don't understand," 3 times in 20 minutes. By lunch, Helen had retreated to her bedroom and refused to come out. Janet assured Marcus this was normal adjustment behavior and would resolve within a few days as his mother adapted to proper techniques. But something felt wrong. Marcus had seen Helen navigate the house smoothly with Maria just days before. She'd moved with confidence, reaching for objects that were exactly where she expected them to be, turning corners without hesitation. Now she seemed lost in her own home. Thursday brought worse news. Helen fell again, this time in the bathroom, because the towel rack had been moved to what Janet deemed a more accessible position. The certified aide explained that Helen was experiencing common resistance to evidence-based modifications and recommended a consultation with an occupational therapist to address her non-compliance issues. Marcus called Maria that evening, ostensibly to check on some household maintenance issue, but really to understand what he was missing. Her voice was carefully neutral when she asked how Helen was adjusting. "She's having some trouble with the new routine," Marcus admitted. "Mrs. Helen, she likes things in the same place," Maria said simply. "Same time, same way. When you move her coffee mug, she still reaches where it used to be. But Janet says the new position is more accessible." Maria was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Helen doesn't need accessible, she needs familiar." That night, Marcus found himself reviewing security footage from the weeks before he'd let Maria go, watching his mother move through the house with an ease he'd forgotten she possessed. Helen would enter the kitchen and immediately turn left, her hand finding the coffee maker without searching. She'd open the cabinet above it and reach directly for her favorite mug, the blue one with the chip on the handle. Her movements weren't tentative or careful. They were automatic, confident, normal. He watched Maria in those same clips, always staying 3 steps behind Helen, never guiding unless asked, but somehow anticipating every need. When Helen reached for the morning paper, Maria had already placed it in the exact center of the kitchen island. When Helen wanted her reading glasses, they were waiting on the small table beside her chair. Nothing seemed forced or managed. It looked like a dance they'd performed together dozens of times. Janet quit Friday afternoon after Helen knocked over a plant that had been moved to accommodate new mobility equipment. In her exit interview, she suggested Helen might benefit from residential care, where her challenging behaviors could be managed by a full medical team. Marcus called Maria before Janet's car had left the driveway. "I made a mistake," he said when she answered. "Can you come back?" "I never left," Maria replied. "I've been cleaning Mrs. Patterson's house next door. She said I could watch from her kitchen window, make sure Mrs. Helen was okay." When Maria returned Monday morning, Marcus decided to work from home to observe exactly what made her different from the certified professionals. He positioned himself at his kitchen desk, where he could watch without interfering, laptop open, but attention focused entirely on the quiet interaction between his mother and the woman he'd almost lost. Maria didn't announce her arrival or launch into explanations. She simply appeared in the kitchen at 7:30, started the coffee maker, and began moving through the house with the same quiet efficiency Marcus remembered. But now he was paying attention to details he'd missed before. The coffee maker was an older model that gurgled loudly when it finished brewing. Maria had positioned it so the sound would reach Helen's bedroom, a gentle audio cue. That morning was officially starting. The blue mug with the chip wasn't just Helen's favorite. It was heavier than the others, making it easier to locate by weight and harder to knock over by accident. The morning paper wasn't just centered on the island. It was placed exactly 18 inches from the edge, the same distance as Helen's comfortable reaching range. Marcus began to notice other details. The living room rug had a subtle texture change at its border that Helen's feet could detect, marking the boundary between safe open space and furniture zones. The hallway to Helen's bedroom had a small wind chime hanging near the entrance that moved slightly when someone passed, creating a soft sound that indicated direction and distance. Even the way Maria arranged Helen's daily medications wasn't random. The pill organizer was always placed next to a small wooden box that made a distinct sound when touched, serving as an audio landmark. "How did you figure all this out?" Marcus asked Maria during Helen's afternoon nap. Maria looked surprised by the question. "Mrs. Helen told me, not with words, with her body. First week I watched how she moved, what she reached for, where she got confused. Then I started making small changes. Move the coffee mug 1 inch closer to where her hand goes naturally. Put a small rug where she likes to pause before turning the corner. She didn't need me to change how she moves. I needed to change how the house talks to her." Marcus had spent 2 years at Stanford studying systems optimization, but he'd never heard anyone describe environmental design as a conversation. The other caregivers tried to train her to use their system. "Mrs. Helen already has a system," Maria said. "It just needed some help." That afternoon, Marcus watched his mother navigate the house with the confidence he remembered from before the accident. She moved from room to room with purpose, her hand trailing lightly along surfaces that Maria had subtly modified to provide tactile feedback. The journey from bedroom to kitchen took 8 minutes instead of 12. Helen was humming. The family audit was 3 weeks away, and Marcus was starting to understand that he'd been solving the wrong problem. His aunt's lawyer had questioned his ability to manage domestic affairs because they assumed domestic meant housekeeping and meal preparation. But what Maria did wasn't housekeeping in any traditional sense. She was creating an adaptive environment for someone with a specific disability, using principles that no certification program had taught her, but that worked better than anything the professionals had tried. Marcus spent the next week documenting Maria's methods, partly for his own understanding and partly to prepare for the audit questions he knew were coming. He started with the kitchen, measuring the exact placement of frequently used items and noting how each position related to Helen's natural movement patterns. The coffee maker's distance from the cabinet, the height of the paper towel holder, the angle of the dish soap bottle that made it easier to grasp without knocking over nearby items. But the more he documented, the more he realized that Maria's system wasn't just about object placement. It was about timing, routine, and what she called predictable surprises. Helen's lunch was always ready at 12:30, but Maria would vary the menu based on Helen's morning mood and energy level. Helen's afternoon walk around the neighborhood followed the same route every day. But Maria would point out different details: a neighbor's new garden, the sound of children playing, the smell of barbecue from someone's backyard, keeping the familiar journey interesting without making it unpredictable. "You're creating redundant navigation systems," Marcus realized during one of their conversations. "Audio cues, tactile markers, spatial consistency, and routine timing. If one fails, there are backup methods." Maria nodded. "When you can't see, everything has to make sense in at least 2 different ways." The insight hit Marcus like a revelation about his own business. His company developed medical monitoring devices that relied on single-point data collection. If the primary sensor failed, the entire system went dark. But Maria was designing with natural redundancy, multiple sensory inputs that confirmed and supported each other. It was elegantly sophisticated, even though she'd never used those words to describe it. As the audit date approached, Marcus found himself learning not just what Maria did, but how she thought about problems. When Helen started having trouble finding her reading glasses, Maria didn't just give her a designated spot to put them. She bought 3 identical pairs and placed them in 3 locations where Helen naturally looked for things: the kitchen counter, the living room side table, and the nightstand. The solution eliminated the problem instead of managing it. When Helen complained about feeling isolated from household activity, Maria didn't just spend more time talking to her. She repositioned Helen's favorite chair so she could hear kitchen sounds, relocated the radio to broadcast cooking shows during meal preparation, and started involving Helen in simple food prep tasks that provided both activity and social connection. Helen began chopping vegetables for dinner, her hands guided by Maria's voice and the familiar rhythm of shared work. 2 weeks before the audit, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He offered Maria a formal position as Helen's care coordinator, with a salary that reflected the complexity of what she was actually doing. But Maria's response wasn't what he expected. "I don't want to be a coordinator," she said. "I want to take care of Mrs. Helen. The job is the same, but when you change the title, you change how people see it, and how I see it." Marcus was starting to understand the difference, but he had to prepare for family members who wouldn't. His Aunt Beverly was arriving from Charlotte with a lawyer and a list of questions about Helen's care plan. They'd want to see credentials, treatment protocols, and measurable outcomes. Marcus had spent the last week trying to translate Maria's intuitive methods into language that would satisfy corporate auditors. But the more he tried to systematize what Maria did, the more he realized that the system was the relationship itself. Maria's effectiveness wasn't just about environmental modifications or routine consistency. It was about paying attention to Helen as an individual person rather than a collection of symptoms to be managed. The certified caregivers had approached Helen's blindness as a problem to be solved. Maria approached Helen as a person adapting to a changed world. The night before the audit, Marcus sat in his kitchen reviewing notes and watching his mother and Maria prepare dinner together. Helen was dicing onions, while Maria seasoned chicken, both of them moving around the kitchen with an efficiency that looked effortless, but that Marcus now knew was the result of weeks of careful observation and adjustment. They talked about Helen's plans to restart her interior design consulting, discussing how she might adapt her methods to work with clients without relying on visual assessment. You could focus on textural design, Maria was suggesting. How rooms feel to touch and how sounds move through spaces. Not everyone thinks about those things, but they matter to everyone. Helen paused in her chopping. You know, I never paid attention to acoustics before the accident. Now I notice how every room has its own sound signature. The kitchen echoes differently when the dishwasher is running. The living room absorbs sound because of the carpet and curtains. It's like learning a new language for the same house. Marcus watched his mother's face as she talked, seeing an engagement and excitement that had been missing for months. This wasn't someone being managed or cared for in the traditional sense. This was someone discovering new ways to do work she loved, supported by someone who understood that adaptation didn't mean limitation. The audit was scheduled for 10 a.m. Tuesday, and Marcus had prepared a presentation that would demonstrate his competence in managing both business and domestic responsibilities. He'd organized financial documents, care protocols, and outcome measurements. But as he reviewed his notes that morning, he realized he'd been approaching this wrong. His Aunt Beverly arrived with the family lawyer and a clipboard full of questions. She toured the house, noting the accessibility modifications and asking about Helen's daily routine. Marcus answered with the systematic approach he'd learned from Maria, explaining the redundant navigation systems and measurable improvements in Helen's mobility and independence. But the real test came when Beverly asked to observe Helen's actual daily routine. Marcus had coached his mother on how to demonstrate her capabilities, but he hadn't needed to. Helen moved through her morning routine with the confidence and normalcy that Maria had spent months cultivating. She made coffee, retrieved the morning paper, and prepared her own breakfast while explaining to Beverly how she'd adapted her techniques. I can't see the coffee level in the mug anymore, Helen demonstrated, but I can feel the weight change as I pour, and I can hear when the liquid gets close to the rim. Maria helped me realize I was already using these techniques. I just needed to trust them more. The family lawyer asked pointed questions about medical supervision and emergency protocols. Marcus had prepared for this, documenting Maria's knowledge of Helen's medications, her response procedures for various scenarios, and her coordination with Helen's doctors. But what impressed Beverly wasn't the documentation itself. Maria, she said directly, what would you do if Helen fell and hit her head? First, I check if she's conscious and if she remembers what happened, Maria replied without hesitation. I don't move her until I know her neck is okay. I call 911 if there's any confusion or if she's bleeding. I call Mr. Marcus if she's okay, but shaken up. I have all the medical numbers on the refrigerator, and I know Mrs. Helen takes blood thinners, so head injuries are more serious for her. And if she has a bad day and doesn't want to get out of bed, I let her rest for a while, then I bring her coffee in bed and ask if she wants to talk about what's bothering her. Sometimes she's tired, sometimes she's frustrated, sometimes she's missing Mr. David. Different problems need different solutions, but I never make her feel bad about having hard days. Beverly looked at her clipboard, then at Helen, then at Marcus. How long has Maria been working for your family? 8 months with Helen, Marcus replied, but I only started understanding what she actually does about 3 weeks ago. The admission felt risky, but Marcus had learned that honest assessment was more valuable than defensive posturing. He explained how he'd initially seen Maria as household help, rather than recognizing her as a skilled professional, creating adaptive solutions for his mother's specific needs. He described the failed attempts with certified caregivers and his gradual understanding of why Maria's approach worked when theirs hadn't. So, you're saying you made hiring mistakes, Beverly stated. I'm saying I was solving the wrong problem, Marcus corrected. I thought Mom needed someone to manage her disability. What she needed was someone to help her redesign how she lives with it. The distinction seemed to register with Beverly. She spent another hour observing Helen and Maria's interactions, asking questions about daily challenges and how they'd developed solutions together. Marcus noticed that Beverly's questions shifted from testing compliance with standard protocols to understanding the logic behind unconventional approaches. The real turning point came when Helen mentioned her plans to resume interior design work. "You think you can do that job without being able to see?" Beverly asked, not unkindly, but with obvious skepticism. "I think I can do it differently than before," Helen replied, "and maybe better in some ways. I understand accessibility in ways I never did when I was sighted. Maria's taught me that adaptation doesn't mean accepting less. Sometimes it means finding more." Udee. As if to demonstrate the point, Helen described a project she'd been discussing with a potential client, an elderly man who was having trouble navigating his own home after a stroke. Traditional interior design would focus on visual aesthetics, but Helen was proposing a design that prioritized tactile navigation and acoustic clarity while maintaining the elegance the client wanted. "Maria helped me realize that universal design isn't just about wheelchairs and ramps," Helen continued. "It's about creating spaces that work for bodies, that move and sense differently. That's a bigger market than I ever served before." Beverly made notes on her clipboard, but Marcus could see her assessment shifting. This wasn't a disabled person being managed by paid help. This was a professional adapting her expertise with support from someone who understood both the technical and emotional aspects of that adaptation. The formal audit concluded with Beverly requesting copies of financial documents and care protocols, which Marcus provided. But the real evaluation had happened during the conversations with Helen and Maria, watching how they collaborated rather than how one supervised the other. That afternoon, after Beverly and the lawyer left, Marcus found himself in his kitchen again, watching his mother and Maria prepare lunch. But now he was thinking about his company's approach to adaptive medical devices and wondering if they'd been designing for compliance rather than for the complex reality of how people actually live with changing bodies. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently in this situation. I actually read them. "Maria," he said, "I've been thinking about something. My company develops monitoring devices for people with chronic conditions. We focus on collecting accurate data, but I don't think we spend enough time understanding how those devices fit into real daily routines." Maria looked up from the sandwiches she was assembling. "What do you mean?" "Like, we make a blood pressure monitor that's very precise, but it's also complicated to set up and requires patients to sit still in a specific position. So people avoid using it, which means we get less data, which makes the device less useful." Marcus paused, thinking. "You'd probably figure out how to make the monitoring process fit into what people are already doing, rather than asking them to change their routines for the device." "Maybe," Maria said thoughtfully. "But first, I'd want to understand why their blood pressure matters to them. Not to the doctor, to them. What do they worry about? What do they hope for? The device should help with those things, not just collect numbers." Helen laughed. "You two are talking about the same thing I'm discovering with interior design. You can create something that's technically perfect, but if it doesn't fit how people actually live, it's not really perfect at all." Marcus spent that evening drafting notes for a meeting with his product development team. Maria's approach to adaptive design wasn't just applicable to home caregiving. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking about problem solving that could reshape how his company developed medical technology. But the immediate challenge was waiting for Beverly's decision about the audit. Marcus had provided all the requested documentation, but he knew the real test had been whether his family judged him capable of making good decisions about Helen's care. That judgment would determine both his custody of his mother and his control of the company. The call came Thursday morning, while Marcus was in his downtown office overlooking Peachtree Street. Beverly's voice was formal, but not hostile when she delivered the audit results. "The lawyer and I agree that you've demonstrated competence in managing both business and domestic responsibilities," she said. "Helen is clearly thriving under current care arrangements, and your financial management of the company shows appropriate oversight." Marcus felt relief wash over him, but Beverly wasn't finished. "However, we have some concerns about sustainability. What happens if Maria leaves? What happens if Helen's condition changes? What happens if you get overwhelmed trying to manage everything yourself?" The questions were fair, and Marcus had been thinking about them since the audit. "I've been working on documentation of Maria's methods, partly to understand them better and partly to create protocols that could be taught to other caregivers if needed. But more importantly, I'm realizing that what Maria does isn't just individual skill. It's a different approach to adaptive care that could be systematized and taught." "What do you mean?" Marcus looked out his office window at the busy intersection below, thinking about systems and sustainability. "Maria's approach is based on observation, adaptation, and redundancy. Those are principles that can be applied by other people in other situations. I'm thinking about developing training materials that teach the methodology, not just the specific techniques she uses with Mom." "You want to turn your housekeeper's methods into a business?" The question caught Marcus off guard, partly because he hadn't been thinking in business terms, and partly because it revealed how Beverly still saw Maria's work. "I want to make sure other families can access this kind of adaptive care, and I want to make sure families like ours don't have to stumble around trying to figure out what works by trial and error." The idea had been forming in the back of Marcus's mind for weeks, but saying it out loud made it feel more concrete. His company had the resources to develop training programs for adaptive caregiving. They had connections to medical professionals, insurance companies, and healthcare systems. But most importantly, they had Maria's expertise as a foundation for developing something that could help families beyond their own. Beverly seemed interested despite herself. "You're talking about systematizing individualized care. Isn't that a contradiction?" "Maybe," Marcus admitted, "but Maria's methods aren't magic. They're based on careful observation and systematic adaptation. Those skills can be taught. The specific solutions will be different for each person, but the approach to developing solutions can be standardized." After the call ended, Marcus found himself sketching out ideas for what such a program might look like. Training modules for family caregivers, consultation services for adaptive home design, technology solutions that worked with human intuition rather than replacing it. But first, he needed to have a conversation with Maria about whether she'd be interested in helping develop something bigger than what they'd built in his mother's house. He drove home to Buckhead that afternoon, finding Maria and Helen in the living room, working on fabric samples for a potential client project. Helen was running her fingers across different textures, while Maria described their visual properties, both of them discussing how various materials might work in a living space designed for someone with limited mobility. "Maria, can I ask you something?" Marcus said, settling into the chair across from them. "What if we could teach other families to do what you've done here? Would you be interested in helping develop that kind of training?" Maria looked up from the fabric samples, her expression thoughtful but cautious. "What do you mean exactly?" "I mean creating a program that teaches the principles behind what you do. Not copying your specific solutions for mom, but teaching other caregivers how to observe, adapt, and create supportive environments for people with different needs. Helen set down the fabric she'd been examining. Marcus, that's brilliant. Maria's approach isn't just about blindness, it's about understanding how individual people adapt to changes in their bodies and capabilities. But who would want to learn this? Maria asked. Families usually want certified professionals, people with degrees and credentials. Some families do, Marcus agreed. But a lot of families struggle with the same problems we had. Professional caregivers who try to fit people into standard protocols instead of adapting protocols to fit people. And there are families who can't afford professional care, but who could learn to provide better support themselves if they understood these principles. The idea was bigger than Marcus had initially realized. Home health care was becoming increasingly expensive and increasingly disconnected from the realities of how people actually lived. Families were caught between professional services they couldn't afford and DIY approaches that often failed because they lacked systematic methodology. Maria's approach offered a middle path. Systematic principles that could be learned and applied by family members, but flexible enough to be adapted to individual needs and circumstances. It wasn't professional medical care, but it wasn't just loving support either. It was skilled adaptive design that could be taught. I'd want to make sure it's done right, Maria said carefully. I don't want people to think there are easy shortcuts to understanding someone's needs. What I do with Mrs. Helen took months to develop. It requires paying attention and being willing to change approaches when something isn't working. That's exactly why we need you to help design the training, Marcus replied. You understand both what works and what doesn't work. You know how to avoid the mistakes that other caregivers make. Over the following weeks, Marcus began developing a proposal for what would become Chen Adaptive Care Systems, a division of his medical technology company focused on training and consultation for families dealing with disability and chronic illness. The program would combine Maria's observational methods with evidence-based practices from occupational therapy, environmental design, and disability studies. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Helen's potential client, the stroke survivor who was struggling with navigation in his own home, had heard about their collaborative approach and wanted to hire both Helen and Maria for a consultation. Word was spreading through Atlanta's network of families dealing with similar challenges. The consultation revealed how broadly applicable Maria's principles really were. The client's challenges weren't about blindness, but about left-side weakness and balance issues following his stroke. However, the same approaches that worked for Helen, redundant navigation systems, predictable routines, environmental modifications that supported natural movement patterns, could be adapted for his specific needs. Maria observed how he moved through his house, noting where he hesitated, what objects he reached for, and how his affected side influenced his spatial relationships. She suggested modifications that were simple but strategic: textured tape on stair edges that his functioning hand could detect, furniture arrangements that provided support without looking clinical, and lighting adjustments that reduced visual confusion. But more importantly, she taught his adult daughter how to continue the observation and adaptation process. Your father's recovery will keep changing, she explained. What works this month might need adjustment next month. The important thing is to keep watching how he moves and what he needs, then make small changes to support those needs. The daughter later called Marcus to say that the consultation had been more helpful than 6 months of traditional occupational therapy, not because the techniques were more advanced, but because they focused on supporting her father's existing capabilities rather than training him to use standardized adaptive equipment. That feedback convinced Marcus that they were on to something significant. Professional healthcare often focused on fixing or managing deficits. Maria's approach focused on building systems that worked with people's actual capabilities and preferences. It was a fundamentally different philosophy that could be applied across a wide range of situations. 6 months after the family audit, Chen Adaptive Care Systems launched with 3 service lines: family caregiver training, adaptive home design consultation, and technology integration services. Maria became the program's lead trainer, working with a team that included occupational therapists, interior designers, and technology specialists. But the program's real innovation wasn't its interdisciplinary approach. It was its emphasis on what Maria called partnership observation, teaching family members to watch, listen, and adapt rather than to manage or fix. The training emphasized that the person living with disability or illness was the expert on their own experience, and that effective support meant enhancing that expertise rather than replacing it. The first training cohort included 12 families from across the Southeast, dealing with conditions ranging from Alzheimer's disease to spinal cord injuries to chronic pain. Each family faced different challenges, but all of them benefited from learning systematic approaches to observation, environmental modification, and adaptive routine development. Marcus found himself thinking about his father during the program's first graduation ceremony. David Chen had built his medical technology company on the principle that good data led to better outcomes. But Marcus was learning that the most important data wasn't always what machines could measure. Sometimes it was what careful human observation could reveal about how individual people experience their changing bodies and capabilities. The ceremony was held in the Chen Company's Buckhead Conference Center, with families sharing stories about adaptations they developed for their specific situations. One mother had created a communication system for her non-verbal autistic son that used household objects as symbols. A veteran with traumatic brain injury had worked with his wife to develop organizational systems that supported his memory challenges while maintaining his independence. An elderly couple had redesigned their kitchen to accommodate the wife's arthritis, while keeping cooking an activity they enjoyed together. Helen spoke at the ceremony about her own journey from seeing disability as limitation to understanding it as a different way of engaging with the world. Maria taught me that adaptation doesn't mean accepting less, she told the families. It means finding new ways to do the things that matter to you. But it was Maria's closing remarks that captured what the program was really about. Every person's body tells a story about how they move through the world, she said. Our job isn't to change that story. Our job is to help write a good ending. If you want more stories about care that looks like this in real life, hit subscribe and stay with us. The program's success led to partnerships with healthcare systems across Georgia and interest from national organizations focused on aging and disability services. But Marcus insisted on keeping the program's scale manageable, ensuring that each training cohort received the individual attention that made Maria's approach effective. A year after launch, the program had trained 60 families and consulted on over 100 adaptive home design projects. The outcomes weren't just measured in functional improvements, though those were significant. Falls decreased by an average of 40% in participating families. Medication adherence improved. Emergency room visits dropped. But the most important changes were harder to quantify. Increased confidence, better family relationships, and what families described as a return to normalcy in their daily routines. The program also influenced Marcus's main company's approach to medical device development. Products began incorporating principles of adaptive design, focusing on how devices could integrate into existing routines rather than requiring people to adapt to new technologies. User testing included not just clinical effectiveness, but ease of incorporation into daily life. Helen's interior design practice had evolved as well, specializing in universal design that prioritized both functionality and aesthetic appeal. She worked primarily with families adapting to disability or aging, creating spaces that supported changing capabilities without looking clinical or institutional. Her projects were featured in design magazines as examples of how accessibility could enhance rather than compromise visual appeal. But perhaps the most significant change was in the Chen family's own daily routine. Marcus had learned to see his role not as managing his mother's care, but as supporting her continued independence and professional growth. Helen had regained confidence in her capabilities and expanded her career in directions she'd never considered before the accident. And Maria had evolved from household employee to collaborative partner in developing innovative approaches to adaptive care. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. It had required Marcus to admit that his initial approach was wrong, Helen to rebuild her identity after devastating loss, and Maria to trust that her intuitive knowledge had value beyond the specific situation where she'd developed it. But the result was something none of them had anticipated: a family structure based on mutual respect and shared expertise rather than traditional hierarchies of dependence and authority. 2 years after the family audit that had threatened to separate them, Marcus sat in his kitchen, reviewing quarterly reports for Chen Adaptive Care Systems. The numbers were solid, but what mattered more was the feedback from families whose daily lives had been transformed by learning principles that Maria had developed through careful observation and patient adaptation. Helen entered the kitchen, moving with the confidence that had become her normal again, carrying fabric samples for a new project. Maria followed with coffee for all three of them, automatically placing Marcus's mug in the spot where his hand would naturally reach while he worked. The Patterson consultation went well this morning, Helen reported, settling into her chair. They're interested in the full home modification package, plus training for their daughter, who's moving in to help with care. Mrs. Patterson reminds me of you when you first came home from the hospital, Maria observed to Helen. Angry about needing help, but mostly scared about losing independence. Helen nodded. I remember feeling like accepting help meant admitting defeat. Now I understand that the right kind of help actually increases independence. Marcus looked up from his reports, struck by how naturally they'd learned to function as a team. The crisis that had brought them together had forced all of them to develop capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Marcus had learned to observe and adapt rather than just manage. Helen had discovered new professional opportunities that built on her changed perspective. Maria had found that her intuitive skills had systematic principles that could be taught to others. But the most important lesson had been about recognizing expertise wherever it developed, regardless of formal credentials or traditional hierarchies. Maria's effectiveness as a caregiver hadn't come from training programs or certification courses. It had come from careful attention to individual needs and systematic development of adaptive solutions. That expertise was valuable precisely because it was based on real-world problem-solving rather than theoretical knowledge. The family audit that had once threatened their stability had become the catalyst for creating something larger than any of them had imagined. Chen Adaptive Care Systems was now consulting with healthcare organizations across the Southeast, training family caregivers and developing adaptive solutions that improved outcomes while reducing costs. More importantly, they'd created a model for how families could navigate disability and chronic illness without sacrificing dignity, independence, or hope. The approach wasn't about accepting limitation or heroically overcoming obstacles. It was about intelligent adaptation that honored both human capabilities and human needs. As evening settled over Buckhead, Marcus found himself thinking about the morning when he'd almost fired Maria to save money and prove his administrative competence. That decision had been based on spreadsheet logic that missed the most important variables in the equation. Maria's value hadn't been measurable in traditional terms because traditional metrics weren't designed to capture the kind of systematic, adaptive expertise she provided. The family had learned to measure success differently now, not just in reduced costs or increased efficiency, but in Helen's return to professional confidence, in Maria's recognition as a skilled practitioner, and in Marcus's development from inherited authority to earned competence. The real metric was sustainability, a daily routine that worked for everyone involved and that could adapt to changing needs over time. Helen's voice carried from the living room where she was finishing notes about the Patterson consultation. "Maria, what do you think about adding a workshop on communication techniques to the next training cohort? Some of the families seem to struggle with how to talk about adaptations without making them feel like medical interventions." "Good idea," Maria replied. "People need to feel like the changes are helping them do what they want to do, not just managing what they can't do anymore." Marcus smiled as he listened to them plan improvements to the program. The conversation reflected everything they'd learned about effective adaptation, careful observation, systematic thinking, and collaborative problem-solving that honored everyone's expertise and perspective. 2 years ago, Marcus had inherited a company and a crisis. Tonight, he was part of a family that had transformed crisis into innovation, creating something valuable, not just for themselves, but for other families facing similar challenges. The inheritance had been financial, but what they'd built together was much more valuable than what any audit could measure. The blue mug with the chip on the handle sat in its designated spot on the kitchen counter, exactly 18 inches from the edge, waiting for tomorrow morning's coffee. It was a small detail in a much larger system, but it represented everything they'd learned about the power of careful attention to individual needs and the importance of creating environments that supported human dignity and capability. As Marcus turned off his laptop and prepared for bed, he could hear Helen and Maria still discussing plans for expanding the training program. Their voices carried the same collaborative energy that had transformed his mother's daily routine into something sustainable and dignifying. It was the sound of expertise being shared, adapted, and multiplied. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to train, new adaptations to develop. But tonight, Marcus felt confident that they'd built something strong enough to handle whatever changes lay ahead. They'd learned that the most important inheritance wasn't money or authority, but the capability to observe, adapt, and create systems that honored both human limitations and human potential. A quick like tells the algorithm this kind of story is worth amplifying, and it helps more families find resources like this. The last thing Marcus heard before falling asleep was the familiar sound of Maria setting the coffee maker for morning, the same routine that had marked the beginning of their family's transformation. Tomorrow, Helen would wake to the gurgling sound that signaled a new day, reach for her blue mug in its predictable location, and begin another day of work that built on everything they'd learned about adaptation, dignity, and the unexpected places where expertise could develop. In 6 months, Chen Adaptive Care Systems would publish their first peer-reviewed research on family-centered adaptive caregiving, with Maria listed as lead author. In a year, they'd launch a national certification program for adaptive care specialists. In 2 years, Helen's design work would influence universal design standards for residential construction. But those future successes would all trace back to this moment. A family that had learned to see crisis as opportunity, to recognize expertise regardless of its source, and to build systems that worked for real people in real situations. They discovered that the most important question wasn't whether someone had formal qualifications to provide care, but whether they had the curiosity, patience, and skill to observe what actually worked and adapt when it didn't. The blue mug would be waiting in the morning, exactly where Helen expected it to be, a small symbol of the larger system they'd built together. A system based not on managing disability, but on supporting capability. Not on maintaining dependence, but on enhancing independence. Not on accepting limitation, but on discovering new possibilities. And in kitchens across Atlanta and beyond, other families would wake up to routines that worked for their specific needs, supported by training that honored both professional knowledge and practical wisdom, creating homes where adaptation meant empowerment rather than accommodation. The inheritance was complete, but the real legacy was just beginning.